Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me for the 17th episode in the Conversation with Alan series tonight. I'm Alan Locher. I created Conversations with Alan to have open and honest discussions about the rise of hate and the rise of anti-Semitism, with high hopes that it leads to conversations that make us all think about our own place in history and what we can do to change our country's course to stop hate in every form. Anti-Semitism is on an alarming rise here in the US, and we are all watching the war in the Ukraine unfold before our eyes. It has never been more important to share stories like the one I will share tonight in hopes history does not repeat itself. Tonight, first-time author Morey Kogul joins me to share his father, Wolf Kogul's experience during World War II. His father was first a refugee, fleeing from the German invasion of Poland into the Soviet Union. He was then a soldier in the Soviet army fighting the Germans. And lastly, after the war, he became a survivor, eventually coming to the United States to start a new life for his family. Morey's first memory of hearing about his dad's experience during World War II goes back to when he was about 7 years old. Growing up with random stories about the war, he was curious, as we all are. At about 17, he started to ask more questions. He asked his father for permission to document his survival story for posterity for the family. After graduation from college, he came back to his father one more time to fill in some of the gaps he first missed. Wolf Kogul gave him the permission he needed to draft a memoir that has become Running Breathless. Please help me welcome to the Locher Room, Morey Kogul.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate the warm welcome, and it's an honor to be on your show and part of Conversations with Alan.
Thank you so much. I'll tell you, first off, thank you, Jody, for connecting us, Jody and George. I appreciate it. I couldn't put the book down. It's such a powerful look at your father's experience during the war. It also felt like I was reading about the current events happening in the Ukraine right now. The way you wrote it, you make us feel like we are on the journey with him, fleeing his home in Poland, traveling through the Ukraine and Russia. I know that was sort of your intent. Can you talk about that intent of making us feel like we were right there?
Yes. The genre has been pretty well covered. I mean, World War II and survivor stories, there are just so many of them. And the minimum promise to my father to just document his memoir, could have been written in any number of ways, and it didn't have to be written in the style that it was written. But I felt sort of a duty and an obligation to be able to channel as many artistic talents as I have available to be able to make this story as accessible and relatable to a variety of readers. And with a particular emphasis on younger readers. I didn't want it to come across as dense as a textbook. And so as a result, there were two things that were very important to me in writing the memoir. One was that I didn't want to be part of this story. I wanted to disassociate myself as the author. And so that's why it's all written in the first person. The idea behind it is that the reader should feel as though they're sitting with my dad and having him relive his experience. And sharing it with you personally. And the other part of it that I felt was important is that the way that historical narrative fiction sometimes can be so captivating and written in a format and a style that makes you feel as though that you are right there reliving it was important as well, because it allows for the reader to feel as though they are immersed in that experience. And so as a result, I sort of dovetailed those two elements of writing the story as though you're hearing it from my father, but transposed in a way that you can be right there sort of along with him and experiencing the events as they unfolded for him. And the goal there was to make sure that the reader felt that connection and to have the story sort of imprint on their memory for, the days and weeks and months after they read it.
You did a bang up job of doing that. It's so interesting. You talk about like that first person account, and it was sort of odd reading this at this time when the war over there is unfolding. For me, you and I weren't around when our parents were experiencing this, and now seeing the war unfold before our eyes because of news media, it's sort of you get a first, a bird's eye view of what sort of both of our families might have been going through during that time. It's kind of just a fascinating.
It's surreal, especially I recall a year ago looking at Twitter, and you would just read accounts of people that were fleeing through the night with only the clothes on their back, and then some young men were conscripted to fight against their will, and you're just reading all of this happening in real time, and it was just again surreal to think about the story and that this happened a generation or two back, and in the same exact cities and in the same environment. Although for the Jewish community, the irony is palpable in that you have a Jewish president in Zelensky, fighting against the Russians, when during World War II, it was in fact the Ukrainians that were allied in many ways with the Nazis. But it just goes to show how a population can turn, and all of a sudden the Soviets, who now Russians were once allied, are now the ones perpetrating all of this violence. So yes, the juxtaposition is deep, and
78 years after the war ended,
right.
Here we are. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to accept. It's also one of those teachable moments where, with sort of a young family as well, we have a chance to talk about that with our teenage daughter and her friends and our community, to sort of be able to learn some of those lessons and see that what transpired during World War II, while so difficult to fathom, is now that much more, and unfortunately so, present in today's life, because they can see it unfolding live on TV.
Absolutely. Going back to your earliest memory of the Holocaust, is it basically that moment at around the age of 7, or did you know sort of about what happened during the war prior to that at all?
So even then, I don't think I associated that with anything that was connected to a war. It was one of those moments of gravity. Most of us in our generation will remember 9/11, and you'll remember how you felt, and what you were doing, and you'll never forget that, right? And those that remember the JFK assassination say the same. And so at 7, I can still vividly to this moment remember my parents coming inside. And I described this in the author's note to the reader about how quite literally it felt like the ambient noise disappeared, and just you could sense the gravitas of something awful that had just happened, of this foreboding. And as a child, I couldn't really understand or associate what it was. And my mom just sort of pacified us and said, just some sad news. And that's where it was. But that feeling never went away. I never really knew why. I just knew that it was. And it was only years later, when I sat with my father, that he explained that was the night that he learned about what happened to his mother, which makes perfect sense. It's like that was there. And so if that sort of arc of memory was filled with numerous stories where my dad would joke about some of the lighter points of his upbringing and tell stories. You never really knew that he carried this sort of trauma, because he was never sort of a sad or depressed individual. He was always joking. There was always a party. And so as a result, it was like that arc that sparked the memory at first.
And back then, people, our parents, that generation, really did not speak much about what happened. It took many people, a long time to sort of put it into words.
Right. I think your own experience as well, is representative of that. I think you would share with me as well that, those stories did not come out easily.
100%. You alluded to the promise you made your dad 29 years ago after a family trip to the Holocaust Museum in Denver. The promise to tell your dad's story. Talk about the visit to the museum, and was there a moment in the museum that where you turned to him and said, I want to share it?
Yes. So it was a really naive request on my part. I did not know, as many teenagers, will probably have experienced at one point or another in life, like exactly what they're getting themselves into. And the museum, for those who haven't been, I highly recommend it, and those that have will know right away. It also leaves lasting memories. Some of the exhibits are really really painful, and they just underscore the cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another. And it was after going through this series of exhibits that at the time the museum had newly opened. This was in the early 90s. And they had camcorders on tripods available, and anybody that had survived the war or had an experience was welcome to record their testimony at the time, right?
Oh, wow.
I think the Spielberg project was ongoing at the time, and there were others that were there just soliciting firsthand accounts. And so, again, not knowing what I was opening myself up to, I said, oh, well, casually, why don't you go and share your story? He never really shared it with me, and I never asked, and I don't know why that was, but so I asked my father there at the time to do that, and there was just a pall of shadow passed over his face, and he just shook his head no and left. So I knew that I touched on a nerve, and I knew that there was more to that, even though my dad sort of just quietly brooded his way through the through the museum on our way back to the hotel. And it was only then when we came back home and we sort of sat in our backyard, and I'd asked him if he could explain exactly why he didn't want to record his testimony, and his answer was, "It's nothing to be proud of." And it was surprising to hear that his experience as a victim of this war and the loss that he endured was something to be ashamed of. And so it was a therapeutic moment for us to sort of work through, to say, there's no shame in any of this. The fact that you survived and hold your hand up high or head up high and have built a family and a life is something to be very proud of. And I want to know that story. And so as a result, I was relentless, and he acquiesced and shared his story. And it's what became this experience of a son learning his father's story. And neither one of us, I think, were prepared for how impactful that exchange would be. Those moments still sit with me, quite deeply, because I had never seen my father, with that survivor's guilt pouring out of him and sharing it. But that was the experience at the museum, and kind of how it inspired into the recordings.
Yeah, I wish I had the foresight to do what you did, because I really implore anybody watching, not even about the Holocaust, about your family's history, sit, if you have the opportunity, with your mother and father and learn things you just didn't know. It took my sister and I a little convincing, because they did record the Shoah, but it wasn't something they were, gung-ho to do immediately, because it was tough. I mean, to sit down and relive those stories. But really,
I couldn't agree with you more about the call to share stories. I mean, our species has been retelling our legacies and our experiences as oral history for tens of thousands of years. This is what we do, and we do it well. And in many ways, it's an art that is sort of challenged by technology and how we tell our stories. But what I loved, if you take the part of the fact that it's my father's story and a Holocaust story aside, what I loved about the process of writing my dad's story was that it was an inspiring true life story that I could learn from and share. And I would ask any one of your listeners as well to take a look at your family histories and ask them questions and learn about what they had to overcome and what obstacles they had. And sometimes it might feel trivial, but it's not. These are your stories, and they should be shared and told and retold. It makes the fabric of our society so rich.
I think that's the biggest like lesson I've learned from just doing the show. I agree. The stories we could, whether it's just, somebody going to school and what you learned from a teacher and, or what you learned, how to get a job, so many lessons if we just listen and talk about them. But it really is so great that you were able to do it while he was living. And that's, the amazing part. And I know you said you were woefully unprepared. How did you, prepare for that first sit down with him?
So I sat down. I remember that the night before, and I just wrote down a whole bunch of questions, and sort of fashioned myself as this journalist. Like, I can do it. I'm going to ask him all these questions. And so I did, and I sort of peppered him with it. I tried to keep everything chronological and tried to put sort of like the most mature hat on as I could. And so the first couple of days were very stilted because
And you were, if I'm not mistaken, around 17 the first time?
17. I was 17, right? And then I learned a very valuable lesson midway through that process, and especially when I graduated college and came back for the second round of conversations, which was to just let him talk. And that was, I'm so glad that I caught on to that early, and especially during the second round, is that ask an open-ended question, be meticulous in your note taking, and just listen to the story and absorb it, right? Don't worry about my agenda of what I want to cover. The story will come out, right? Just let him share it, right? And so that was the lesson that I learned in interviewing him. And I feel like some of the greatest podcasters and journalists today, tend to adopt that technique of allowing their guests to tell the story.
I started this almost 3 years ago. It took me a little while to get there, but I totally agree. You let them go, let them roll with it as much as you can, because by just letting them share, you really do get so much more from it.
So yeah, it was very fortunate to also have had, and it also took my father, a lot of credit to him, in having the courage to stand there very vulnerably and share these stories. That was really hard, and we had to be incredibly patient, because there would be moments where he would just stand up and walk away, and that was it for the day. And then a tremendous debt of gratitude to my mom, who was there throughout these recordings, because she served as the sounding board for him. She consoled him, and was there to be supportive, helped with some of the interpretations of some of the language challenges, and just sort of explaining, cultural, idiosyncrasies. So I definitely have to make sure that I recognize the role that my mom played in the interview process.
That's awesome. You took everything you learned, you put it into a binder, the recording, put it on a shelf. At that time, you didn't know you were going to put it into a book. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's sure. All I knew is that I wanted to hear my father's story, and off I went to college. I went to the Ohio State University, and off I'm experiencing college life. And as you may know, on Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day, there's a tradition to read the names of the victims. And so, in the middle of the campus quad, sponsored by the Hillel there on campus, we're all doing this recitation. And it just dawned on me there that these are people whose stories may never be told. Their names, and we're honoring them, but their stories were never told. And I have an opportunity to do that. So it was in those shadows that I recognized that I have, and I was fortunate to have my father as long as I did, mm-hmm. and with the sort of cogent memory that he had. It was remarkable. His recall was incredible years later, and so that's where I realized I don't know what this book will look like, but I have to put it pen to paper and do that. So that was when I recognized I had to do it.
It is interesting, because I spoke to someone who's 91 recently, who is a Holocaust survivor, and the memory is incredible. And you were so lucky to have him as long as you did. Was he as willing when you asked him for the second round?
Yes, I think that there was only one topic that was touchy, and that was the story about his mom. He refused to discuss it the first time, and I knew that there was a real painful memory there. And when he ultimately revealed that, and there's a chapter dedicated to that in the book, he says he really wishes he never knew, and I can't blame him. Just like that, you feel helpless altogether, right? But just the degree of torment there weighed on him. But other than that, he was willing to answer my questions and fill in the gaps. There were some things that we probably missed, I'm sure, but
oh my God, there's so much.
I was grateful to get what we had.
You have incredible, and there's a lot. I mean, of painful memories of what he witnessed from 19 years old onward. Talk about that. Your dad was living in Poland. He was 19 when the war broke out in Dubno. Share the story.
Sure.
He left his family behind.
So the whole story is really just, as you know, just a remarkable coincidence of luck and good fortune all the way through. Just the ability to have survived, probability is just incredibly low. So my father was always mischievous.
I mean, incredibly low from just leaving at 19 on your own, weather, the war going on. I mean, there's
the numbers bear it out. There were 15,000 Jews that lived in Dubna, and 300 survived.
That's
so we just let that sink in. And of the I think if my numbers are right, 3 million or so Polish Jews that lived in Poland before World War II, approximately 2 million of those were on the Soviet occupied side, because in 1939 the country was split in two, half under German occupation, half under Russian. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and initiated that first mass assault, there was no systematic murder at that time like the concentration camps. This was just an onslaught of initial invasion, and people were murdered in mass pits where they ran, and so as a result, it was entirely chaos from the get-go. And so my father, at 19 years old, suspected that something was wrong. He didn't know that he was never going to see his hometown again or his family again. He just knew that he wanted to find some information that would be useful. And as a young man, he felt that, let me go to the next town over and see what I can do to come back to my family with some reason for hope, a place to go, a plan of some kind. And the parents there, my father's parents, they knew that this was likely going to be a traumatic and perilous situation, and so they parted with him with hopes and prayers, and had this sense that it was not likely to join, the family would not join together again. But it didn't sink in, and my father didn't absorb that. He just left because he wanted to find the opportunity to help his family. And the memory that burned within him the most and tore at him the most,
I know what you're going to say,
was my father was a middle child, and his older sister was protected for a period of time by a Ukrainian family that agreed to take her in and hide her. And his younger brother, who was 15 years old at the time, came running out the door, begging my father to take him with him. Now, this is just 2 days after the war started. Airplanes were bombing, tank shells were in the distance, and people were making harried plans to go wherever they wanted. So my father's brother, begs him, just let me ride on the frame of the bike with you. So my dad just sort of like shoves him off and says, listen, I'm not going to be able to make it very far with you on the frame. Like, I'll be back soon, and just rides off. And he really tore at himself. I can still visually remember him just like pulling at his hair and just in anguish. And we just had to assure him all these years later, like, how could you have known what would have happened? This is not your fault, right? But he blamed himself his entire life for the loss of his brother, because from all accounts, his whole family was murdered. And so my father,
a long time to hold on to that, guilt.
Right. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you would never know it to have met him, right? I mean, he would make a life out of any party. You would never know that this is a man that harbored that type of pain within. And so the way that he described it and the way he explained it is that he never really took anything seriously. That to him, like, life was a game. And I find it hard to square like that mindset sometimes. But there's an element of truth in what he said, that when we even see news reports of tragedies, of car accidents, there's always this sort of interest of people going out and wanting to just learn what's going on. There's this interest in rubbernecking, and so to many people, it seemed as if it was hard to sort of reconcile this idea of a war with an adventure. But in my father's eyes, as a 19-year-old, this was an adventure, and you know what? He seemed invincible and didn't think that anything would happen. And so he quite literally ran by foot the distance from Washington, D.C. to Miami in 6 months, by train, by horse, literally dodging bullets, all the way until he was absorbed in a collective farm. And so the book details that experience entitled Refugee, of what it was like for him to flee an invading German army as a civilian, narrowly making it through any one of those instances, which would have taken his life and took the lives of thousands of others. And so when he was in this collective farm that was far enough into the Soviet interior, he had spent a winter, helping out with whatever was expected of the farm. And at that time, the term conscription wasn't as well known, I think, growing up. Now everyone that's following the Ukraine war knows exactly what conscription is. Mm-hmm. And so the Soviets came around with convoys and said, here's a gun and here's a piece of bread and go fight. And so he fought as a soldier, through the entire territory of where he had fled. He was fortunate that as they were fleeing, he would connect with people that were friends of friends or relatives. And it turned out that his first cousin, Jake Grossberg, and he managed to flee together for most of the war. And I talk about that in the book and that experience. And it's a bit of beautiful poetry that, at the end of that experience, they both ended up living together in Denver, Colorado, well into their 80s and 90s. So they remained close throughout. So it was just
that is a incredible story of survival. The fact that two young men made it through all of what you're describing,
right?
And you're not even describing some of 0-degree weather, harsh weather, bullets everywhere, explosions everywhere. And I just, the vividness of it because of what's happening right now. I mean, Poland, Ukraine, Soviet Union, it's so, the juxtaposition, like you said earlier, is just really unreal,
right. Yeah, it really did dawn on us as well. It's served as a backdrop for the different youth groups or others, groups that I talked to about my father's story and Holocaust lessons as well. So just I think just to round out the summary of the story is that after the war, he ends up going to Moscow. The war ends. The Soviets don't see this as sort of a conclusion. they see it as sort of like an ongoing struggle for sort of their national identity and project of sort of a communist presence in Europe. My father, desperately finds a way out. That's a whole other very detailed, amazing story of how he ends up escaping. And then with the assistance of, and it's, I think, important to call out these refugee support groups now, because they are the same groups that were the subject of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. These same Jewish refugee groups that help people that are, victims all over the world were the same groups that helped my father make his way to displaced persons camps in Italy. And so that arc of support of what the Jewish community has been able to do to make sure that people that need help in whatever is the best way for them to get help, were there for my father. And then, and so my father spends 5 years in this displaced persons camp in Italy, and makes his way to the United States, and is then drafted into the U.S. Army and serves during the Korean War, and after honorably discharged, made his home in Colorado. And so as a result, always had a strong affinity for the country that absorbed him, and the honor of the country that made him welcome after the war.
Incredible that he served our country after.
Right. No, it's incredibly proud.
You should be, and he should be. You initially put this all into a 40-page outline that you were able to share with him before he passed. He read the whole thing? What was his reaction?
So he and I sat. We actually went to a bookstore in Denver, and it was in the wintertime, and he and I were sitting over coffee, poring over this, and I went over, page by page with him, and then he sort of sits and nods his head, takes a sip of his coffee, and says, "That's exactly the way that it was. You can put it together." Those were his words. And so there's a bit of regret on my side that I never completed the work while he was still alive, and that's just one of those situations where life takes over, family, other obligations, and as a result, this project sort of sits on a shelf, and it's a creative project, and as you know, in order to really do creative work well, you have to immerse yourself in it, and so I owe a huge debt of gratitude for many things, but to my wife Rachel for this, because when our son Jonah was born, I took whatever moments I wasn't tending for him, I had him in a baby Bjorn and a laptop, and I was just writing. And Rachel was so supportive to sort of give me the time of whenever I would need to work on the memoir, because I felt like one of the best ways to honor our son is named after my dad. One of the best ways I could honor him was to fulfill that life goal and that promise to him. So I wasn't able to share it with the finished product with him while he was alive, but we did sit together and review the outline, and he blessed it. And so as a result, the best I can hope for is that somehow, somewhere, he knows that I've honored his memory that way. And another also shout out again to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, which was so supportive of the research effort and corroborated the story, because I mean, a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, so as a result, I can't attest for every date, fact, and so forth. But I did rely on their expertise to ensure that the sequence of events was accurate, and it was. And in fact, they said that they hadn't heard of many stories like of the ones that my father experienced, because there were just such few examples of people that survived. That part of the war, and any other anecdotes of memoirs or stories of people that survived on the Soviet interior, probably written in Russian, and we don't really have access to them, in English. And so they made the book, the museum, part of the collection in the reference library. And so I'm honored that they've decided to make it part of their collection. And so therefore, another way to honor my dad is making it that part of our sort of history.
And absolutely, the fact that it's in the museum, that his story lives on, and that's important. And he knows, he absolutely knows. For somebody who hasn't read the book yet, What do you want people to take away from reading your dad's story?
So there's a few elements there that I think are important. In the book itself, I provide footnotes to historical events. I create this sense of urgency in the book by showcasing how, as my father flees a town, here was the devastation that followed. My father could have never known that, right, at the time, but I include reference material for people to go to and learn on their own. So education is one element of the story, is that I want the story to stand on its own for someone to feel captivated as though they've read, sort of an action-paced sort of feature film or docu-series style drama, but one that prompts further research and education and knowledge. So one of the goals is that. But that also spawns not just education for awareness sake, but also for understanding of some of the events that sort of prompted the reasons for your conversations with Alan, right? And that is to understand that, and one of the things that I still struggle with myself is how a society can turn in on itself. Like, it's not as if the 1920s and 30s Germany was, a medieval savage, crusading empire. It was outside of some technological, changes and evolution, for the most part, in many ways, as westernized a place as we have today. And it's astounding to me that a society can turn in on itself. And so one of the educational goals of the book to take away from my father's story is that we should be very careful about some of the early warning indicators that could create these sorts of conditions, because if it could happen there, I can't believe that I could say these words, but could it happen again? I can't say no. And as a result, learn from that. And I try to make the story, when I give this talk, and especially the teenagers, it's a story about a young man. It's a story about a teenager. It's about a teenager that played soccer, that played baritone in his school band, that was involved in his community, that went to dances, that was mischievous. It's about a kid. The story is about a kid, and it's about a kid that had to experience something horrible. And so we should take from it these lessons about, how we treat one another, and understand that because there are differences in our communities, there are so many shared values there that we should take note and be careful about how we talk about our differences and how we treat those that may not have the same ideals. Because I do worry about Jew hatred. I can't. It pains me to talk about it with my children, but I am worried about it, and I do hope that the book serves as promise to my dad, inspiration for education, and an opportunity to sort of help prompt conversations for civil discourse that make our world, in many ways, a more accepting place.
Beautifully said. Speaking of the Jew hatred, it's so interesting because before my parents died, I'm sure they really knew anti-Semitism still existed. I think growing up, you and I probably knew, but we are at such a new level that I feel like it is the first time for me now at 56 that I am more concerned than I probably ever was in my, growing up to this point. What we're witnessing and seeing and hearing is just, really, I mean, this began because for me, Charlottesville was an eye-opening experience that I never thought we'd really see.
It's staggering, right? It's one of those where if you take a look at the waves of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism over the eons, right? And we're about to celebrate Purim here soon. So here's a story that in many ways is representative of exactly this sort of issue. I perhaps naively thought in my 20s and 30s, we're still so close to the Holocaust that, gosh, we've probably got another couple hundred years before we see this sort of thing again. I really thought, I can't remember what it is, like Moore's law. I think that like as you keep going, like further and further things get
Well,
extended.
that's why I say the number, Morey, 78 years since the war ended.
Right.
Like, I feel like we can't be repeating ourselves at 78 years. Like, it just seems, first of all, that seems so far. And also, like, it just should not be something we're witnessing.
Right. But it's there, right? So I think that what we can't do is deny it and pretend that it's not an issue. And so there's others that are more expert in this than I. I feel like there's several important things for us to consider, and one is for parents of Jewish kids or people that work with Jewish kids. I think the idea of establishing strong sense of identity is important, right? I feel like part of the way that this sort of anti-Semitism is successful is when the Jewish population in and of itself doesn't feel confident enough to speak up for itself. And so I feel like that sort of voice is important, but that doesn't solve it alone. And I think what's important is our rabbi has this great line that he's used repeatedly, and it's the idea of we can use every friend that we've got. And so I feel like when you take a look at the foundational values that the Jewish people broadly have, right? And it's hard to say like Jews are a monolith, because my gosh, we are absolutely not. But I think what's important is to understand that using those same base values of acceptance and understanding and relationship building is fine ties to build those bridges. And that's what's so important, is for those that are active in a number of different communities, bring people into understanding why being Jewish is important to you, right? So if you are, proud of like the gay community, bring people from the gay community over to the Jewish community and vice versa, and build those bridges and alliances, right? And find the common values that are there that are so important to both groups. And in the United States, I think that we have this great line of finding a more perfect union, and I hope that what we can do in this country is serve to work together to ensure that the fringe voices that perpetuate hate speech and anti-Semitism remain at the fringe. Like I don't think it's realistic to think that it's going to be eradicated. I think the idea is that we have such a strong core of people striving towards a more perfect union that we will be able to overcome any threat to that unity. So
absolutely. It's interesting too, because I've had some people say to me, they're surprised that I speak up as much as I do on social media or this, because, clearly I am Jewish and putting it out to the world at a time when it is a little unsafe for us to be doing it,
Right.
But I feel, without our parents here, what your dad went through, what my parents lived through, we have to be doing this. We owe them that much to be speaking up and using our voices to make sure it never happens again.
So in addition to, like, if I can ask one question back, so in addition to the conversations with Alan, any sort of recommendations of ways that we can sort of address some of these threats or worrisome experiences in our society?
I really, whether it's conversations with Alan or anything, I think it is sharing these stories. We are one and the same. We are human beings living in this country. We all deserve equality, whether you're Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, all of the gay, straight, all of it. We all deserve to be treated equally. And, people just don't see that. They, blinders, so much hate, and misinformation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's important to find a way to sort of bridge this us versus them mentality, and find a way for us to understand that there's going to be differences, but those that but find the commonalities and the happiness.
We all bleed the same color.
Right, that's true.
We really do. We are all humans. We all come from the same place. Basically, it's really astounding. you are raising two kids. You are raising a teenage daughter and a son who will be 7.
Yeah.
You know, how do you articulate sort of what is going on in the world, and how much do they know about your dad's experience at this age?
So our daughter knows all. She's old enough to be able to, comprehend and understand all of that, and we're very proud of her for her just involvement in her community, both secular and Jewish. Uh, the high school that she goes to never had a Jewish student union before, and so she and other sort of intrepid, teens have decided to say, we're going to make a public show of solidarity, not necessarily directed at saying we need to combat anti-Semitism. I feel like that's the reactionary response. The one that I so value of what they've done, and they've done it organically as teens, which is to say, we're proud of our backgrounds and who we are, and we're going to make sure that we have a place that celebrates that within our school. And so they have set up this Jewish student union, and will work to build ties across the school community and the community at large. So that's, I think, a great example of how she and her peers are building those bridges that we're talking about. And I hope that will endure as they, move on towards their lives in college and in the professional world, that these experiences and these bridges hold. And I'm optimistic. I think
I'm optimistic about the children. I mean, I was so impressed after the Parkland shooting at the articulation and the passion that the young folks in that school district demonstrated, with what happened. Is your daughter in a Jewish school?
No, we're in a public school system. So very, very happy with the school system, but yes, a public school system.
But are there other religious groups like that in the school? Do you know?
I believe that there are other religious groups. There's also various other sort of ethnic and cultural groups as well represented. So the school has that. The county is very supportive of student-led diversity. I think if my memory is correct, so I could be off on this. I think there's only one other school that has a high school Jewish student union. So there may be others, but I know for now her school is the first one setting that up. So the school, has been great about supporting and endorsing that, and again, it's really up to the kids to lead it. So they're inspirational in that way. And our little one, for him, it's about the idea of just having, fun connections. For him, he still sort of identifies people's backgrounds by the types of holidays they celebrate. Like for him, it's all just sort of fun. Like, do you celebrate, Ramadan or Christmas or Hanukkah, that kind of thing. And that's how he connects to it. But what's great is that he has become, very proud of his own identity, and he likes celebrating the Jewish holidays. But he also has, and because he's one of a few Jewish kids in his class, he's also very interested in all the other holidays and the backgrounds, and so he celebrates them and enjoys them. So that's nice to see that he can both balance, pride of his own background and experience while celebrating that of his peers.
That's interesting, because I feel like kids today, like, my girlfriend from high school talks about her sons having gay friends and things. And it's just like everything for the younger generation, there is to some degree a lot more acceptance in all diversity, whatever, religion, sexuality. And I think, listening to what Hannah created with her friends at school, I wonder what that could have done for me as, having something like that, to feel that connection to my religion, because I didn't have that as a young man, because I wasn't in a very large Jewish community.
It's a great point. I didn't have that either. So I went to a public school and was one of a very small number of Jews at the school. And so my connection to Jewish community was outside. I was involved with the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization and so BBYO, and then some of the other affiliated Jewish youth groups. And so that's how I sort of maintained that balance. And I was always openly proud of being Jewish in my school, but it really never became like sort of a focal point or an issue just because it was not very common. But I agree that it would have been better to have had the opportunity to build those bridges then through a more organized structure, because at that time I feel like what we could have done is create stronger ties throughout the school population that would have endured beyond that, and as opposed to having that done in a silo somewhere else outside of the school. So I completely agree with you. I think that would have been
and the bonding experience of bonding, with others. It's powerful, to share the experience together.
Yeah, I'll have to give further credit to our temple as well for the amount of interfaith work that they do, because we will have oftentimes Christian youth groups come over for a Shabbat service, and we'll do social action together across denominations. So I feel like that gets done at the congregational level, but very very proud of the kids and Hannah's efforts.
I think my May conversations with Alan will be an interfaith show with a rabbi, a priest, and some other families who have raised their children that way, and hopefully a child as well who has been raised interfaith.
Right. I look forward to tuning in.
I think that's a great, conversation. Morey, today, here you are, 2023. Do you feel you've kept that promise to your dad?
So, gosh, it's so hard to believe that the story has been read and heard so many times. I never would have expected it. So, by virtue of publishing the book, yes. But the amount of feedback that I've gotten from the people that have been captivated by the story, that said that they've learned something, that said that they were touched by it, that it prompted them to do more, the conversations that I've had about his experience, and what I've really enjoyed as well are the conversations where this invites other people to share their stories, right? So when we start sharing ours, the natural human reaction is to be like, oh, well, let me share my story with you. And so the promise to my dad, my hope is, in many ways, has served to sort of fulfill hopes and promises for other families that have had a chance to explore or research or share their stories too. So I hope that I have not only fulfilled promise to him, but continue to do so every time the story is told and shared.
Well, I definitely think you did. And also by just, talking about sitting down with him, again, before we end this tonight, people, sit down with your families, learn as much as you can. What, about how your parents met, anything.
Right.
It's great stuff that we, regret. You'll regret someday not knowing. Like, I really wish I had done what you have done. Is there a story or a connection you've made through the release of this book that stands out immensely in your mind?
So yes, so it's very local. So Howard County, Maryland, where we live, has a Holocaust Remembrance Committee, it's a Yom HaShoah committee, and so once I published the book, I learned about this committee and approached them to see if there was any way that I could continue to honor my father's legacy by serving on this committee, which puts on an annual memorial program, and it's geared, unlike perhaps International Holocaust Remembrance Day in January, which has perhaps a broader overtone. The Yom HaShoah one, which is typically in April, has more of an introspective, internal, sort of Jewish feel, and And we're now at the point where we used to have first generation or actual survivors. We're now sort of left with just our second generation and third generation folks. And so the connection with those people that serve on that committee, that are committed towards reliving the memories of their loved ones and of the lessons of the Holocaust, I feel is a connection that in many ways I think represents kind of what you're asking about, and one that I'm very, very fortunate to be a part of, and so honored to work with them on an annual basis to put that forward. So I feel like that's the one. The other is, of course, any opportunity to talk to kids and have kids pick up the story and read it. That pays dividends that will go well beyond what I would have ever expected.
Well, that is a perfect way to end this evening. Keep me in mind. There's not many of us second generation. I am on board to help any way I can.
Well, we will certainly do that. That'll be fantastic. I really appreciate you inviting me onto the show and being part of Conversations with Alan. I think that what you're doing is phenomenal, and enjoy all the work that you put out.
Thank you so much, Morey. Pleasure to meet you. Keep up your work as well, and let's stay in touch.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much, Alan.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Please pick up Morey Kogul's book. I encourage you to read Running Breathless, An Untold Story of WWII and the Holocaust. As I leave you tonight, remember, we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard things, and let's all fight to stop hate in all its forms. I truly do believe conversations like this can change the world around us. Stay tuned for the next conversation.